stay awake. Twice mentioned in today's gospel that part of our spiritual discipline in recognizing Christ in our midst is that we need to stay awake. It might be good for us to start with remembering a time when it was difficult for you to stay awake, when that feeling of tiredness and fatigue comes over us and all we want to do is close our eyes or lay down and take a nap. Thanksgiving is a great time to take a little nap after our Thanksgiving feast. And I know certainly half of my family were sleeping on the living room floor at my house. And my younger brother, Russ, he was at 8:30 Mass, so I didn't tell the story, but he accused me of not offering him dessert when he was having trouble really staying awake. And we know that certainly that part of us that has sometimes difficulty staying awake physically, that this gospel encourages us to look at this not just in a physical way, but in a spiritual way as well. In seminary, when we begin, intense spiritual formation, many of my spiritual directors and much of what is written about the spiritual life and the lives of the saints is really about staying awake, having attention that we need to see and apprehend the varied life of God always around us. This gospel passage reminds us of that kind of attention that we need, that spiritual attention. The first Sunday of Advent really begins where we end. So last week we celebrated the feast of Christ the King, and we hear images of Christ returning again in glory, and we do not know the day or the hour, so we need to stay awake. This feast of Advent then continues us to the celebration of Christmas, where we step back in time, always knowing and believing that we need to be aware of opportunities to love and to serve. The next few weeks, we're going to hear from John the Baptist about the attention that we need to see Christ in our midst. Matthew, in today's gospel, uses the image of Noah's Ark. And really, it's a beautiful story for us to really begin to understand, again, not necessarily in a literal way, but as a way of understanding salvation. That in the story of creation, the story of God separating and dividing the sky from the land and then the sea from the land, we know that God is the one who brings order. And when humanity understands its place in relationship to God, order is fulfilled in the Garden of Eden when everything is right with the world. But from the beginning of Adam and Eve's sin, then disorder began to creep into the world. Our ancestors began to die earlier and earlier. The old age in which they lived was taken from them because their life from God was being taken from them. And then we have that story of the Tower of Babel, where there is confusion and disorder because God is the one who brings order and peace to our lives. And in the story of Noah's Ark, it was so bad that humanity was so not themselves that God was saying, I need a redo. I'm going to disorder the world the way it was before creation and start over again. And Matthew is saying to them, but the people were not paying attention. They weren't paying attention to God. They weren't paying attention to who they are as God's children. And because of their lack of attention, because of their sinfulness, everything was taken away up to the time when Noah and the animals entered the ark. If only they had paid attention. If only they had stayed awake. And Matthew then says to us that there's going to be a day when that's going to happen to us, when Jesus is going to return again in glory, and some will be taken and some will be left. And the key to entering the heavenly kingdom that God has prepared for us is that we need to pay attention. We need to stay awake. And what does that mean for us spiritually as we begin our intense preparations spiritually for the feast of Christmas? Do we recognize opportunities to serve all around us? Are we people willing to take time for prayer and reflection? This afternoon, our second graders are going to make their first reconciliation. Are we willing to follow in their footsteps and find a place and a time this season of Advent to celebrate reconciliation, to go to confession? Are we aware of people that are in need around us? All of these ways are ways that we can spiritually be awake for the presence of Christ who is in our midst. So too you also must be prepared for an hour when you do not expect the Son of Man will come. So stay awake. This time of Advent is a time for us to awaken ourselves spiritually so that we might truly understand the meaning of the season of Christmas, when right in our midst, God is saving us. So stay awake.